Alrighty. We're in person today
Yeah.
discussing how we see multiple dual relationships in clinical practice. Do you want me to start us off?
Yeah.
Um, this is something I hadn't thought about as much as I should look at you. Getting used to
Okay.
recording in person, whether to look at the screen or at Emily. I hadn't thought about this. I've thought a lot about touch and psychotherapy, but I hadn't thought as much about the dual relationships. And so it was interesting to hear about living in a small town and how different that would be from like if you're in a bigger city, you could refer out more easily, but if you were the only therapist and um yeah, you can't really avoid having dual relationships if you're a therapist living in a smaller town. And I have no idea what size town I'm going to live in, but I can see how that would be complicated, like running into your clients all over the place. And like the example of like even, I guess it's a little different now because of online banking, but the example of like cashing your clients' checks means that like the teller at your local bank is going to know those people are in therapy. And so just a lot more to be aware of if you're living in a small town and like needing to maybe um like bend the guidelines a little bit more than if you were in a bigger city where you can just like refer out if you realize that like your kid's teacher is a former or is a current client, then maybe refer them out. But if you can't do that, then you just need to navigate it.
Yeah, I feel like everything that you're bringing up and bringing in, I feel like would just be like another thing to add for like informed consent of like if that is the case, like a small town or even just like LGBTQ plus, like I feel like having that in that maybe that it's like a possibility or like a just to like prepare maybe if there were like another experience where you would run into someone like a client or like ground rules. I feel like there was an example where a therapist um would be like, oh, like would you be okay with like me saying hello and just that, like not saying like I'm so and so's therapist, so just like clear communication on like, oh, if we end up running into each other at
Yeah.
this dance that we like know
I'll
that
let
we
you
both
initiate first. Yeah.
but it's tricky because it's like maybe one client would be like, please don't look at me, and like, one like wants to really engage, but then again it's like tuning into like what each client needs and like what their comfortability is, and just like talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah. From the readings, it seemed like the main way that a dual relationship comes up with a current client is like if you are living in a small town and can't avoid it, or if you're bartering with clients. I hadn't even thought about that possibility, but I can see how complicated it could become with bartering. But then the other category of dual relationship is like once someone's no longer your client, whether it's okay to maintain contact and like transition to friendship. And yeah, that does seem tricky to navigate. In certain situations, like if there's like a deep bond and the person's doing really well and like you're in a small community to like we have a dog here that's asking for snuggles. That's
Mabel.
hmm.
Yeah, I think it just like obviously it just depends because it's like, yeah, if you do have a deep bond and you're no longer the therapist of your client, that like I don't know, it's so tough. It's like, is that in the client's best interest?
Yeah, and that's the question to keep coming back to. It sounds like there might be a scenario where it really is, but it also could get complicated. Yeah.
I have a friend that was seeing a therapist for like probably a year, and they have super similar interests, and like they no longer were working together, but then they started like grabbing lunch, and like now they're co-facilitating a retreat together.
Oh, wow.
And it's like been a positive experience, but I think that you can't just blanket that, right? Like,
Hmm.
oh, well, I have so many interests and we're gonna run into each other. It's like that it still just depends, and it like comes down to each person and each relationship, and being like really, as a therapist in that dual, different shift of relationship, like I feel like the awareness needs to be like really strong, and like, but then I feel like there's also more opportunities for blind spots to come in
Hmm.
or to show up.
Yeah. So like getting consulting with someone to get another perspective and like being really honest and with that person and with yourself about like what's motivating it and weighing the pros and cons. Um, and then obviously like the clear there it's very clear cut around sexual relationships
Mhm.
as opposed to friendship, but it sounds like there is like depending on which code of ethics you choose to follow, like some say that they're after a certain number of years you could have a sexual relationship with a client, but that like if it went sour and they sued you, you'd have a lot to explain and like your whole
Mm.
practice would be under a magnifying glass. So it just sounds like I remember Doris saying in her video, unless you like cannot live without this person, like
Mhm.
just better not to.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah,
Yeah.
so should we shift to the touch?
Yeah. What do you think about therapeutic touch in psychotherapy and clinical work?
Yeah, I have a lot of opinions about this topic because of my
Mhm.
own experience in therapy and how helpful touch was when it started coming in. Like for so many years, I feel like I didn't even know that was an option. And it was
Mhm.
very like, the therapist sits like pretty far away, like further than a friend sits, and like
Mhm.
more of that kind of maybe coming out of the psychoanalytic tradition without realizing that's the kind of therapy I was getting. Um, and then, yeah, I just found it really helpful, like with modalities coming out of somatic experiencing, like with touch skills and
Mhm.
somatic practice, and just like basic touch that's super regulating to the nervous system and like working
Mhm.
with the way our bodies can naturally co-regulate. Like it allowed me to explore so much more and feel so much more in a safe way than I would have otherwise. And it just felt really empowering and like the boundaries were so clear. And I'm really grateful. Like it seemed like the person I was seeing was like taking a risk at that time because that was like 10 years ago. It
Mhm.
seems like it's more common now and people like advertise that they do that, like licensed therapists. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, it was like a game changer for me. And so I definitely want to offer touch in my own practice and just did the Tamura method training that uses touch
Mhm.
and like working somatically. Like you can definitely connect with the body without touch, but I just feel like it's a really powerful tool. And it was helpful to hear like more about what to be cautious of and like how it can elicit sexual feelings in clients and like
Mhm. Mhm.
to not have it be misconstrued and just like how important it is to be super clear with boundaries and
Yeah.
communicative. What about you?
Yeah. As a yoga teacher, like this is a common topic too, of like, oh, can I do hands-on assists like in the class? And a lot of teachers just opt out, and I don't, and I ask for consent in the beginning of the class in a way that like people can't see. And so it's like um, you know, no one's like looking at everyone. And I just personally like have, yeah, gleaned so many benefits from physical touch in my life, whether in a yoga class, in a therapeutic setting, like that's it's just, yeah, super, super powerful. And I think that there needs to be like so much intention behind every touch. And like, I think about the energetics behind it, like just I can geek out on this stuff. And like I think that with a like in a skillful way in therapeutic container, like I think it's like gold.
Mhm.
And I also think it can be really harmful and like confusing, but
Mhm.
I think like just the amount of benefits that it can provide. I am like so interested in learning how to bring that in a really skillful and safe way in a therapeutic
Mhm.
container for sure.
Yeah. And like the trainings on touch and like applying it in like very specific ways is one thing. And then I hadn't thought as much about like giving hugs and like
Mhm.
when that might be appropriate and when it could be confusing. And
Mm.
there was something in the reading that just like really struck me. I think it was a real example of someone who came in for their first therapy session after like, I think it was they lost their infant son in a drunk driving incident. Did you read this one?
Oh.
Um, and like wanted the therapist to hold her
Mhm.
in her grief. And he would explained why, like he couldn't do that. This is talk therapy, but like referred her for a prescription for Valium. And then like 10 years later, this therapist that was writing saw her and she was like deeply addicted to Valium, like
Oh,
went with her to
geez.
the infant son's grave that she had never visited
Oh,
and held
yeah.
her. And like that's just like I just feel like that's such a potent example of when like risk management is like counter to the client's like just human need for some
Totally.
touch in a time of like the deepest grief that's possible. So like
Yeah.
that's a good one to like remember and like I can feel that I need to explore more like the nuances of the more informal touch. I'm clear I want to use touch training, but like how to navigate those moments where it's like, ooh, in this moment, I need to decide whether to like offer
Mhm.
this thing that this person's asking for. So yeah, there's a lot in this topic.
Yeah. And just last thing, like the one of the readings where it was the interview, I think it was like a radio show. Um, I think like the therapist said that we as interns, like versus therapists that have been in the field for like 30 years, like we actually are more like present and like instinctual with like, oh yeah, like if someone's like, can you please hold me? It's like, yeah, I will hold you because you've like asked for this and like we're connected versus like that's not in the rules and like by the book. And I think what we're speaking to just reminds me of like the humanness of like one, we're all human. Yes, we as therapists like are trained and have these like codes and rules and laws and regulations to abide by, but at the same time like we're human and I think like it can get lost of like all of the rules and regulations and it's like I think that the intuition like each person's intuition and attunement is so much more than it's like being with another versus these like, oh, I can't
Mm-hmm.
do XYZ because of the law. It just feels like I understand that it's important and in this field specifically, like touch specifically in this field, like
Yeah.
just makes sense. It's like it's healing, it's a modality that heals and can harm, but it's like that doesn't deter me from like utilizing it, right? And like learning how to.
Yeah. And if it's like unclear, like following intuition rather than like, oh, risk management. And you can always like
Totally.
go check in with the person, like get a consultation and be like, I did this in the moment because it felt right. Like, is what do you like? So
Yeah.
yeah, just like watching out for that tendency to manage risk rather than like be in your heart with another person.
Or like cut that off, like our like,
Mhm.
yeah, that innate humanness, right? Of like, yeah, touch. I don't know. It's like a no-brainer, but I know that I'm sitting here like not in practicing it right now, but I'm super drawn to it.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, wait.